Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Old English literature. This class, as we've said before, is going to cover a lot of literature, starting with the earliest literature we have in the English language. So to orient you to that, in case you haven't read Old English literature before, I want to give you a little bit of historical context and then an introduction to the first works that we'll be reading. So first of all, let's establish when were the Middle Ages. The Old English time period lasted roughly from 449 with the invading Anglo-Saxons, who were the people who became known as the English, until the year 1066, which is the date of the Norman Conquest. And the Middle English time period runs from around the year 1100 to roughly 1475 when Caxton introduced the printing press to England. So here are a few important dates. So first of all, I'm going to go back to a time before the English lived in England. The original people living in England, at least that we know anything about language, were Celts. In the year 55 BC, the Roman Empire invaded the Celts in England. In 43 AD, they came back and meant business. They came back and conquered the Celts with large armies. The Romanization of the Celts became complete between the years 75 and 85 AD, and during that time, the Celts became Christianized. Around the year 410 AD, after several hundred years of Roman occupations, the Romans withdrew and left the Celts, and the Celts had really depended on Roman military, so this left them in something of a bind. 449 AD marks the date of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. The Anglo-Saxons were Germanic tribes, various tribes actually, that came into England and ultimately displaced the Celts and ultimately became the English people. The term English comes from the tribe Angles. So those invasions began in the year 449. Around the year 597, Christianity began to spread in England. The Celts were Christianized along with the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons were not Christians, but around the year 597, they did adapt very readily to Christianity. That's important because they could not write or read until the church came in and learning was in the church. So we're going to read what's said to be the earliest piece of literature in the English language, and it's called Caedmon's Hymn, and it's part of a larger work called Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Caedmon's Hymn dates probably around 658 to 680, and Bede puts Caedmon's Hymn in his larger historical work. Bede was a monk writing in the 8th century. Once the Anglo-Saxons came into England, pretty much drove off the Celts, settled in, quit warring with each other. These various tribes didn't get along even with each other, but gradually they began to settle down. And right when they did, just when things began to get organized, new invaders came in. These were the Vikings. The year 809 to 839, King Egbert, who, if you've seen the web video on monarchy, you've heard about him already. He became known as, some say he was the first king of England. All acknowledged his lordship, and he represented the dissolution of what was called the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. And that was a group of different tribes that finally unified under the reign of Egbert. King Alfred the Great is very important to anybody reading Old English literature because he had a number of works translated into English, and one of them was a history called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. In the year 878, Alfred is also famous for making a at least temporary peace with the Vikings, which resulted in a treaty called the Treaty of Wedmore, and it created what was known as the Danelaw, which basically gave the Vikings the north part of England and the English the southern part. The years 878 to 1042 were a period of political adjustment. There were still battles against the Vikings recorded in 2 poems, which we'll be looking at least one of them. The Battle of Brunanburh and the Battle of Maldon both give accounts of the Anglo-Saxons fighting the Vikings. And near the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, we actually have a Viking king on the throne. The Danish king Sven seized the English throne and became king, driving off the unfortunately named Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready. Really, his name meant ill-advised, but it's translated as unready. Sven never really got a chance to rule, though. He died, and it was his son Canute who became known as the first of the Viking kings. In 1066, Ethelred's son, Edward the Confessor, returned to rule England when the Viking line died out. He was succeeded by Harold, son of his advisor Godwin, and the people were in favor of that. But back over in France, he was challenged by William, Duke of Normandy, who seized the throne. And this great battle was known as the Battle of Hastings, or the Norman Conquest. And it greatly changed the literature of the time, and it marks the transition from Old to Middle English. I'm going to show you here, this is an animation of the Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry is a Norman production. And it's this huge tapestry that someone animated as a project, but it shows this battle between William and Harold, and again, it's brought to life and animated. So let's take a few minutes to look at this. Harold was declared king, and the French perspective has him going to France. This is after the line had died out, the English line had died out with Edward the Confessor. William was furious that Harold betrayed him, and he began to prepare for war. He ordered that a fleet be built. Here's William over in Normandy building his fleet. He supplied the ships that would be going to England, and his goal was to go and defeat Harold and claim the throne, which is exactly as we'll see what it does. So here they are loading the ships. Getting into ships and traveling over to England. Meanwhile, poor Harold was having a really hard time in England. Normans had sailed across the channel. Harold was up north fighting more Vikings as they're traveling. And by the time he travels back south, he's very tired. So here's William still traveling. You know, it's a little bit of a trip. His army lands near Hastings. They set up a camp. They actually had a good bit of time to rest at that camp, which gave them an advantage in battle. They prepared a banquet in his honor. They had time to party. So remember, this is actually a tapestry someone has animated. So there they are, having a dinner. They were able to build themselves nice defense mechanisms. And they didn't mind pillaging and plundering to make way for the Norman army. And then as Harold got closer, William prepared for battle. He sharpened his sword there. The Norman army advanced. And it would have been the lower class was held in a raging battle. William rallied his troops for the final charge, and actually, what William did, well, I'll have to tell you in a minute. Harold ended up being killed in the battle. So the untold story here, because this is a Norman perspective, the untold story is that, yes, Harold got killed in battle. The usual account is that an arrow pierced him through the eye, and his girlfriend, not his wife, but his girlfriend, Edith of the Swan Neck, had to identify the body because he was maimed in other ways as well. But what the Norman perspective, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a French or Norman creation, what it doesn't tell you is that Harold actually was winning the battle at first. And William's army did something that just really seems unfair by our standards today. They feigned or pretended a retreat. And that made Harold's men relax. And they came off the mountain or the hill at Hastings, where they were located strategically. You have an advantage if you're on a hill and your enemy isn't. So they relaxed and they came off of the hill, which put them all on even footing. And that is when William ended up killing Harold. William took over, and it greatly changed England. The changes thereafter mark huge differences in language and literature. So we're going up to that point right now. And then later we'll come back and pick up with Middle English literature, which is after this particular date. And let's see. Let's go to our next slide. Some of the genres that, some of the genres that you can encounter as we're reading this literature. If we had time, this semester we're moving very quickly, but if we had time, we would read elegies. The Anglo-Saxons like to write about exile. That was the worst thing that could happen, was for one to be exiled. When we read parts of Beowulf, you'll notice Beowulf's father was in exile. It's a terrible fate, and the elegies portray that, what happens when you're kicked out of your homeland. There were histories and chronicles, not in the sense that we know today, where we aim for reality. A chronicle or history might have a dragon fight in it. They thought if you could glean truth from it, you could call it a history or a chronicle. There are heroic poems, battle poems that reflect the values and traditions of the Anglo-Saxon people. And there are a lot of religious poems because language was in the church, most in the 7th and 8th century by Northumbrian monks. The Venerable Bede, who we'll be reading first, was one of these monks. And often the religious poetry also had this heroic kind of battle terminology to it. And there are also charms and riddles and tracts and other genres that we won't get to this semester. So I'm starting you out reading a little section from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Caedmon's Hymn is a part of it, written in Latin. So what Bede was doing, he was writing a religious history of the Anglo-Saxons. And when he tells about Caedmon, this is one little story in this big history, he provides the only biographic information that we have about any Old English poet. Caedmon's Hymn is probably the oldest extant Old English poem. Only Bede wrote it in Latin, and oh well, but it's said to have existed in Old English. The Tale of Caedmon is really a very enjoyable tale to read. It's about a cowherd who was unable to join in the singing that happened at night, and they told stories orally. Hardly anyone could read if you weren't in the church, so it was their method of entertainment. So they would, pass around the mead, and everyone would take turns telling a story or embellishing a story, and Caedmon couldn't tell stories very well. So he goes back to the barn, he goes to sleep with the animals, very humble man. And in the night, he's visited by an angel or Christ-like figure who gives him the gift of song. And this is the first work we have that combines the Anglo-Saxon method of storytelling, which usually would have been stories about war and battle, with the religious subject matter brought in with Christianity. So there was no printing press. Everything we read was written on parchment. And I wanted to show you a little bit what Old English would look and sound like. This is the English language. So this is Caedmon's Hymn in the original. This is an interlinear translation. A very simple little poem. The story surrounding it is entertaining. The hymn itself is kind of typical. But I'm going to read it out loud so you can hear Old English. And yes, this is English. Nu Shulon Herieon Heaven Riches Weird, Meo Totus, Meakta and his Moria Thok, Weark Wulder Fader, Swa He Wonder Jawas, Etcha Drikten or Unstaleda, He Ara Shop E Elda Beanum, He Avontarova Holly Sheepen, Thamiden Yaird, Man Kunus Weird, Etcha Drikten After Teoda, Ferum Folden Freya All Mikti. Okay, so that sounds nothing like English. It was sort of a mix of German and Latin, but this is English. This is English in its earliest form. There's some letters and sounds that you don't recognize. And if you actually, were to read Beowulf or any of these works in the original Old English, you'd probably need a whole graduate class devoted to it. So, yeah, sometimes when I teach Shakespeare to freshmen, they tell me, I can't read that, it's Old English. And I have to explain, no, Shakespeare is early modern. This is Old English. Fortunately, though, you will be reading everything in translation. Just wanted you to know what it sounds like. So that's the first poem we're going to read. Let me say a word or two about the second, The Dream of the Rood. These are religious poems we're starting out with. Then we'll move into some battle poems before Beowulf. So The Dream of the Rood, a rood is a cross. It's a poem that personifies a cross. The poem was probably inspired by a real cross called the Ruthwell Cross. It's in Dumfriesshire. It's an Anglo-Saxon stone cross, 18 feet high, with the words of Christ carved on the sides. The poem was written in Mercia in the 9th century, and it borrows the idea. So it looks like the cross came first and then the poem. Christ is presented as if he were an Anglo-Saxon warrior. Comitatus is the close relationship that you get between a leader and his men, and it reflects that kind of language in a presentation of Christ. The cross is one of Christ's followers, the dreamer is another, and the second part of the poem takes the place of a homily. So I talked about a dreamer. This poem takes the form of a dream vision. Someone falls asleep. This man who says he's a sinner, he falls asleep. He dreams about a cross. The cross happens to be the one that Christ was crucified on, and then the cross speaks to him. And then he wakes up and decides he's going to go and spread the word of Christ after this wonderful dream of this cross. But the language in it is really beautiful. I think you'll enjoy reading it. And I'm going to close out this little presentation by showing you what is a replica of the Dumfriesshire cross. And the words from the poem, some of them are written around the periphery of this. So this is just a little introduction to get you going, especially as you start Old English literature with Caedmon's Hymn and The Dream of the Rood. Hope you enjoy.